Хьюитт Брайан Джордж, профессор, доктор философии, член Британской академии, профессор кавказских языков Школы восточных и африканских исследований Лондонского университета с 1996 года. Хьюитт обучался в Кембриджском университете. Здесь в 1972 году он получил диплом бакалавра, в 1973 году диплом лингвиста, в 1976 году магистра гуманитарных наук. С 1982 года доктор философии. В 1981-88 годах преподает лингвистику в университете Хулла. С 1988 по 1992 годы преподаватель лингвистики и кавказских языков в Школе восточных и африканских исследований. В этой же школе в 1992-96 годах он старший преподаватель. С 1996 года профессор кавказских языков. Джордж Хьюитт – первый президент Европейского общества кавказоведов, почетный консул Республики Абхазия в Великобритании, член Британской академии, почетный член Международной Черкесской академии наук, член Абхазской академии наук, почетный профессор Абхазского государственного университета. Награжден Абхазским орденом Ахтзебша в 2004 году. Медалью Министерства иностранных дел Абхазии за заслуги в 2013 году. Джордж Хьюитт – автор или редактор 18 книг, автор 217 научных статей и рецензий.
Добро пожаловать на нашу передачу, на кафедру. Место Кавказа в современной геополитике. Вот двумя словами, есть у вас точка зрения по этому поводу?
Идеально, очень хорошо было бы, если мы имели возможность говорить о кавказском векторе. Но, к сожалению, я думаю, что пока рано, потому что первым долгом нужно решить здешние конфликты. Потом, если это реально, надо произойти региональная интеграция.
Для ученого-лингвиста, кто занимается языками, я думаю, что характерно очень бережное отношение к языкам, культурам. Вот скажите, на Западе в разное время возникали разные теории. Скажем, теория плавильного котла была теория. Потом возникла теория мультикультурализма. И еще новые концепции, я не буду распространяться. В целом, ваши отношения?
Как
европеец, как вы относитесь? Как западный человек?
Понимаю. Как представитель крупного этноса, я здесь ничего страшного не вижу. Для меня все равно, или один, или второй вариант. Но я, конечно, понимаю, если представители этнических меньшинств имеют другой подход. И если они боятся утраты языка и культуры. Но для меня все равно, мультикультуризм или второй вариант.
Спасибо большое, ваша позиция ясна. Но я вас приглашаю на лекцию.
Ага, спасибо. זה הכוח, יתבו בידוד זנה שהחיה זה יחיה, סתמז, סתה שמצן נחה, אנגליז בשאלה סוגלרוב, וואה шутба.
Добрый день, друзья! В эфире «Кафедра», лекции на абхазском телевидении. Гость нашей программы Джордж Хьюитт, профессор кавказских языков Лондонского университета, почетный консул Республики Абхазия в Великобритании. Добро пожаловать!
Well, I've named my presentation Historical and Modern Aspects of Foreign Interest in the Caucasus. I won't be able to deal with everything, but I hope that what I have to say you will find interesting. Given the critical location of the Caucasus Isthmus at the intersection of Europe and Asia, where it forms a bridge between, if one is still permitted to use such terms, Occident, which became predominantly Christian, and Orient, predominantly non-Christian, it is hardly surprising that this relatively small parcel of land has attracted the attention of larger powers over the centuries. We can all think of this in the context of the Greeks, the Romans, Persians, Arabs, Turks, and of course latterly Russians. And one might broadly classify foreign interests under the three headings. One, expansion, in terms of increasing a foreign entity's actual physical presence, or more abstractly, that entity's increasing influence in the region. Secondly, acquisition of and the desire to spread knowledge about the locality, its peoples and cultures, including, of course, their languages. And thirdly, trade. And so let's examine some relevant points, concentrating, where possible, on Western Transcaucasia. This is, of course, the area of prime concern to you, today's audience, and we'll confine ourselves largely to the work of scholars and travellers under the second heading I just listed. Known to Western civilization since the 8th century BC, when the ancient Greeks, specifically the Ionian Greeks from Miletus, established colonies, for example, Pitsunda, today's Pitsunda, along the eastern shores of the Black Sea, the Western Caucasus, Western Transcaucasus in particular, has always been distinguished for its multi-ethnicity. As is well known, at the start of the Christian era, for instance, the geographer Strabo observed how Dioscuria, later called Sevastopolis, designations for today's Abkhazian capital Agrba, served as the commercial centre for the peoples living in the mountains above it and for the surrounding neighbourhood. Whilst Pliny Secundus, in the second half of the 1st century AD, speaks of it as a depopulated Colchidian town previously famed for the fact that up to 300 representatives of people speaking different languages would gather there for the purpose of carrying on trade, with whom the Romans needed 130 interpreters, according to Strabo, that is. Colchis was, of course, the fabled land of the Golden Fleece in the popular myth of Jason and the Argonauts. And in recent years, this myth has become a common theme in a rather tiresome nationalist debate as to which Caucasian people or peoples might have been the original denizens of this realm. Sadly, one frequently has the impression that certain commentators are incapable of recognizing the difference between legends and historical reality. In fact, it is most likely that the area was always cosmopolitan in makeup. And, as the Mingrelian scholar Simon Janashia acutely observed, Colchis was for the ancients a rather loosely defined entity, employed more as a geographical than political term, and even then with uncertain boundaries. Though for Strabo, it extended roughly from Pitsunda in the north round to Trabzon in Turkey. Whilst we have lists of tribes inhabiting the eastern Black Sea coast from the middle of the 1st millennium BC, it is not straightforward to identify them with this or that ethnic group known to have resided here later. The ancient Greeks, unfortunately, were not particularly interested in non-Greeks or the details of their languages. However, from the 1st century of the modern era, we are on safer ground regarding the residents of at least part of today's territory of Abkhazia, when we read of the Absilian race, gens Absila in Latin, in the work of Pliny Secundus, 23 to 79 AD. and a century later of the Apsilians, Apsilai in the Greek, of Arian, 86 to 160 AD. The Abkhazian self-designation being, of course, you know, Apswa, Apswa. The Apsilians' northern neighbours were then stated to be the Abazgians, Abaskoi or Abazgoi in Greek. Procopius of Caesarea, 500 to 565 AD, in his History of the Gothic War, also introduces as neighbours to the Abazgians a people he calls Bruchoi, which has plausibly been postulated to be the first clear appearance in history of the Ubuchs, who call themselves Tach. I have discussed the ancient ethnonym several times over the last 20 years, most recently in my long online review of Donald Rayfield's book, Edge of Empires, A History of Georgia. I cannot repeat here all the arguments, but I should like to linger for a moment on the identity of a people mentioned called Myssimians, Myssimianoi in Greek, by the historian Agathias Scholasticus, 530 to around 590 AD. Agathias was chronicling the years 552 to 558 in the reign of the Emperor Justinian I. Georgian commentators over the decades have hypothesized that this tribe, along with most, if indeed not all, the others mentioned as living in the region by classical writers, were Kartvelians of some sort. Classicist Simon Qaukchishvili specifically argued as early as 1936, and this is the book in which he presented his argument from 1936, that the Myssimians were Svans, the ancient term deriving from the Svans' self-designation Mashan, plural Shanar. A conclusion unfortunately reiterated by Rayfield without any supporting argumentation whatsoever. Whereas at first glance this interpretation might look plausible, a careful reading of Agathias's text reveals this equation to be quite unsustainable, as Qaukchishvili, as a distinguished classicist, should have recognized. Agathias places the fort of Tibelius on the border of the territories of the Myssimians and the Apsilians. This toponym clearly equates to Tzabao in the Kodor Valley. And Agathias describes the Myssimians' slaughter of the Byzantine general Soterichus in these words, quote, Soterichus went down into the country of the so-called Myssimians, who are subjects, like the Apsilians, of the king of the Colchians, but they speak in a different language and also pursue different laws. This English translation is rather ambiguous as to which two of the three peoples mentioned are being contrasted in terms of their languages and customs. Is it the Myssimians and the Apsilians, or the Myssimians and the Colchians? Well, we can ask, is the Greek original equally open to contradictory interpretations? In fact, for reasons I don't have time to enter here, the interpretation is crystal clear in the Greek. The Myssimians, whilst they are subjects of the Colchians, differ from them in language and customs. The phrase, like the Apsilians, is an appendage to the first qualifying remark about the Myssimians and is to be understood as stating that both the Myssimians and the Apsilians were subjects of the Colchians. Taking these observations, together with a later passage in Agathias's text, namely that the Myssimians killed the ambassadors sent to them by the Apsilians, despite the fact that the Apsilians were a common, related perhaps, and neighbouring people. Taking that then into account, we can confidently conclude that Agathias provides unchallengeable testimony to the cultural and linguistic relatedness of the Apsilians and the Myssimians. Agathias does refer in his history to the Svans, but makes no attempt to link them with the Myssimians, which simply underscores the correctness of the Myssimian-Apsilian association. And since it is beyond dispute that the Apsilians were the ancestors of the Abkhazians, the Myssimians must have been just a subdivision of this ethnic group, as long argued by Abkhazian historians. The Greek ethnonym was thus in all likelihood an attempt to render the Abkhazian surname or clan name Marshan, for the Marshan nobility traditionally lived around Zabal, as indeed was noted by the late Yuri Voronov. And so there is important evidence relating to the Black Sea's eastern littoral for the period before Abkhazia became linked to Georgian-speaking lands, available in various ancient writers seeking either to provide knowledge of the region, like Pliny and Arrian, or to chronicle Rome's imperial activities here, such as Agathias and Procopius. Moving forward, we find the 10th century Arab geographer al-Mas'udi emphasizing, as had been done a millennium earlier, the multiplicity of languages found in the Caucasus, when he styled the isthmus Jabal al-Alsun, mountain of tongues. From around the 14th century, Genoese trading posts start to appear along the Black Sea's eastern coast, and it was during their presence here that a certain Archbishop Johannes de Galonifontibus passed through the Caucasus in 1404, making in Latin the following concise, but not always entirely accurate observations. Quote, "The country called Zikia, or Circassia, lies at the foot of the mountains on the Black Sea. They have their own language and writing. To the east of them, in the direction, beyond these Circassians, is Abkhazia, a small hilly country. They have their own language. To the east of them, in the direction of Georgia, lies the country called Mingrelia. They have their own language. Georgia is to the east of this country. Georgia is not an integral whole. They have their own language." End of quote. Whilst one can argue over the correctness of the identification of the Ziks with the Circassians, a topic of current dispute, I'm afraid, between Abkhazian and Circassian historians, and I will not address that today. And one might wonder about the reference to Circassian having a writing system at such an early epoch. Nevertheless, the clear distinction between Abkhazia Mingrelia, or Abkhazians Mingrelians, and Georgia and Georgians is surely highly significant. 1404. The Catholic Church now has a part to play in our story. Though the request of Georgia's Queen Rusudan, 1222-45, she was daughter of Queen Tamar, the request of her to Pope Gregory IX for military assistance against the Mongols had been rebuffed. Nevertheless, in 1289, Pope Nicholas IV dispatched a mission which was allowed by Georgian King Vakhtang II to set up an episcopate in Tbilisi. But it was only in the 1620s that the Vatican began to take more serious interest in Transcaucasia. This was as a result of the embassy from King Teimuraz to both the King of Spain and the Pope in the guise of one Niceforo Irbach. I'm not certain of the pronunciation, but anyway. He travelled in late 1626 or early 1627. The Fide press in Rome then pioneered the first printing of Georgian books between 1629 and 1643, but most importantly for us was the sending of missionaries of the Theatine order to Mingrelia at this period when the Ottoman Turks were introducing Islam along the coast in Abkhazia and Circassia. Don Arcangelo Lamberti, 1600 to 1699, lived in Mingrelia for 20 years, from 1633 to 1653, writing a well-known description of Mingrelia on the basis of his experience there. And Don Giuseppe Giudice also sent letters from Mingrelia to Rome in the 1640s. Both works contain fascinating information about life in and around the area of their missions. Their writings need to be supplemented by the work of the half-Turkish, half-Abkhazian travel writer Evliya Çelebi. His travel book, dating from the 1640s, includes, in addition to Georgian, especially valuable linguistic material for the unwritten languages Abkhaz, Ubukh, which he called Sadzian Abaza, Circassian and Mingrelian. One of Cheleby's observations was that leading Abkhazian families also spoke Mingrelian, the also being deliberately omitted by Pavle in Gorokwa when in the late 1940s he manufactured his absurd hypothesis that the people we know today as Abkhazians only migrated from the mountains into Abkhazia in the 17th century, where they assumed the ethnonym of the original Georgian-speaking, we should say Kartvelian-speaking, Abkhazians. This is, of course, as is well known, an absurd theory. Lamberti placed the frontier between Abkhazian and Mingrelian at the river Kodor, information which he passed to the Franco-British traveller Sir John Chardin, 1643 to 1713, who in his own comments on Mingrelia noted the peculiar fact that it was not necessary to have an education to be ordained a priest there. It was enough, he said, to know how to read and to learn by heart and then repeat throughout one's life the text of the church services. These were conducted in the Georgian language. This apparently was as difficult even for the Mingrelian clergy, let alone the illiterate Mingrelian peasantry, to understand as Latin was for the contemporary peasants of Western Europe. Surely a point to be considered in the debate over whether Mingrelians are or are not Georgians. In the wake of the Mongol incursions and depredations, the unified medieval Georgian state had fragmented, the various parts being prey to Turkey in the west and Persia in the east. Russian interests in pressing south had seen a variety of embassies dispatched by the Tsars to Georgian rulers between 1589 and 1605. But it was only from the late 18th century that Russia became a real player here, threatening the largely Muslim North Caucasian peoples and consolidating links to Transcaucasia by the construction of the Georgian military highway between North Ossetia's Vladikavkaz and Tbilisi, opening up regular traffic from around 1799. However, it should be reckoned a universal truth that in order to be effective in foreign territory, one should first acquire a thorough knowledge of it. And the level of ignorance about the Caucasus then existing in Catherine the Great's Russia is nicely illustrated by this quote from Isabel de Madariaga's book on Catherine the Great. Quote, "Russian relations with the Caucasian kingdoms were complex and tenuous and left a great deal to the discretion or indiscretion of local commanders. So little was known about the area that when an emissary of King Solomon of Imereti asked to be received in St. Petersburg in 1768, Catherine called for maps and found that according to some of them, Tiflis was on the Black Sea, according to others, it was on the Caspian Sea." End of quote. Russia then had to come to grips with the frontier lands to its south and initiated a series of research missions undertaken by the Academy of Sciences. The first such explorative group was headed by Johann Anton Güldenstedt, 1745 to 81. Born to a German family in Riga, he gained his doctorate from Frankfurt am Oder. He was invited in 1768 to head a 7-man expedition to the Caucasus on behalf of the Imperial Academy, of which he became a full member and professor of natural science in 1771. Catherine ordered a number of such expeditions to collect data on her empire and also to make observations of the passage of Venus, which occurs roughly every 100 or so years. The Caucasus group spent 7 years on their travels, for around 12 months of which they were in western Transcaucasia, though it was only from Imereti that the team was able to gather data about Mingrelia, as it was deemed too dangerous for it actually to try to enter this region. Güldenstedt died in St. Petersburg in 1781, aged just 36. 2 volumes resulted from this expedition. They were published in St. Petersburg after Güldenstedt's death by Peter Simon Pallas, the work being entitled Dr. Johann Güldenstedt, Reisen durch Russland und im Kaukasusgebirge, so travels through Russia and in the Caucasian mountains. The work takes the form of a diary describing when the team was where and what it saw there,
the place, soil, water, flora, fauna, insects, population, and what the locals did. Güldenstedt did not ignore the languages, discussing their relationships and possible origins. He had a list of words translated, albeit with gaps, into the various languages in order to facilitate comparison. 290 were the most lexical items he managed to illustrate. His fourth family grouping was Kabardian and Abkhaz. Kabardian and coastal versus North Caucasian Abkhaz. That's to say, Abkhaz proper versus Abaza. From the Northwest Caucasian family, there is no mention of Ubukh. Translations were obtained via translators, Güldenstedt himself not knowing either the local languages or even Russian. Hence, there are inconsistencies of treatment. For many of the languages, Güldenstedt's list represented the first time they were documented, even to the extent of word lists of this size. On the basis of his lexical comparisons, Güldenstedt was the first to make some progress in classifying the languages and produce the highly pertinent observation that, quote, Mingrelian stands in the same relationship to Georgian as does Dutch to German, end of quote. Güldenstedt took the trouble to familiarize himself with historical documents. Treating the relationship between Abkhazia and Georgia, he remarked, quote, in olden times, the country, Abkhazia, had its own ruler, who in the Georgian chronicles is referred to as the king of the Abkhazians, king of Abkhazia. Later it belonged over a long period to the king of Georgia, who then was referred to as the king of Abkhazia and Kartli, that's to say Georgia. At the time of this leadership, Greek orthodoxy became widespread, and a patriarch even sat in Bichvinta, Pitsunda, whilst in Mokvi, Muk, and Dranda, archbishops were installed. Later they became independent of Georgia, and there is no unitary leadership. End of quote. Speaking of the Georgian province of Mingrelia and the districts of Odishi, which he said lies to the north and west of Mingrelia, as well as Lechkumi, he states, quote, in Odishi they speak Mingrelian, whilst in Lechkumi in a mixed Mingrelian-Imeretian dialect. End of quote. Güldenstedt's text is, I would suggest, worthy of closer study. Named Christian Rudolf Ehrlich, at birth in 1744 in Eisleben in Germany, Jakob Reinegs studied at Leipzig University and gained a doctorate in medicine from Tyrnau in Hungary in 1773. From 1779 he worked for King Erekle of Kartli or Kartli-Kakheti, sometimes they were combined, where he introduced Western systems for printing money and preparing gunpowder. He oversaw typographical and printing works in Tbilisi. Reinegs came to the attention of the Russian authorities and was appointed personal commissioner at Erekle's combined court, Kartli-Kakheti, by Georgy Potyomkin. He was thus enlisted in Russia's plan to persuade both Erekle and his counterpart, King Solomon of Imeretia, to adopt a pro-Russian orientation. The culmination of this plan was the signing of the Treaty of Georgievsk with Catherine the Great's Russia in 1783. During his time in the Caucasus, Reinegs became well acquainted with the entire region. His writings were published, again in 2 volumes, 1796-97, with the general title in German, General Historical Typographical Description of the Caucasus. He was not well versed in philology, though in the following citation he correctly identifies the border between Abkhazia and the Georgian province of Mingrelia. Quote, the river Ingur, splits the Abkhazians and Laz from the best-sited, fertile, sometimes low-lying, sometimes hilly and mountainous province known as Megrel or Samegrelo, Mingrelia, end of quote. So there we have the border placed at the Ingur. But his linguistic naivety is illustrated in the comment, quote, Mingrelian is the name of the people residing here who have their own language. It represents a mixture of dialects of Caucasian, Greek, and Georgian words. Not something a linguist would want to say today. However, with reference to the debate over the historical connections of South Ossetia, Reineg's comment might be of some interest. He says, "And in truth, they, the southern Ossetes, live even now in that area which first Pliny and then Moses Chorenatsi named as the fiefdom of the As and the Rossi." End of quote. So, little comment about South Ossetia. The kind of linguistic observations being made by the likes of Güldenstedt and Reinegs in the Caucasus about the genetic affiliations of the languages there encountered were in line with the famous statement by the British Orientalist Sir William Jones, made in a lecture in 1786, that the similarities between Latin, Greek and Sanskrit were too many to be explicable by anything other than the assumption of a common origin. This realization sparked off a race to study the languages of Europe, Asia, and ultimately the whole world in order to understand the nature of their diversification and to classify them into family groups. So, in furtherance of the Russian Academy's interest in the Caucasus, Julius von Klaproth, born in Berlin in 1783, spent 16 months in the Caucasus in 1807-1808, having taken part in a previous mission to China. He died in Paris in 1835, having worked there for a decade. The results of his Caucasian endeavours were published in 1812 and 1814 under the short title, in English from the German, Travels in the Caucasus and Amongst the Georgians. An English version came out in 1814, whilst a French version appeared in 1823. Klaproth asserts that he was instructed to use and correct the materials left by his predecessors and boasts in a supplementary volume entitled Caucasian Languages, supplement to the Journey into the Caucasus and Amongst the Georgians. This supplement to his original publication, he boasts of his superiority over Güldenstedt in relation to his ability to compare Caucasian and other Oriental languages. Now, whilst Güldenstedt essentially confined himself to offering vocabulary items and comments thereon, Klaproth incautiously attempted to move into grammar. However, his superficial and often mistaken remarks meant that this was in fact a retrograde step in comparison with his predecessor. Like many others, Klaproth was tempted to find typically Indo-European, specifically Latin and Greek, patterns in languages outside this particular family, assigning accusative cases to Caucasian languages where no such case is actually attested, though Mingrelian is interesting in this regard. Also, he rejected Güldenstedt's accurate classification by arguing that Abkhaz and Circassian are not genetically related, proposing an entirely erroneous link between Circassian and Finnish, Ostyak and Vogel, based merely on a few lexical similarities. He was unfamiliar with the basic principle of comparative linguistics being worked out at the time, that genetic affiliation between languages must be demonstrated by discovering strict sound correspondences that take the languages back to a common source. The French Orientalist Marie-Félicité Brosset, the younger, 1802 to 1880, came to Georgian and Armenian studies, also from Chinese, actually, like Klaproth. Invited to Russia in 1837, he was elected to a fellowship of the Russian Academy the following year. He continued to work at the Academy until 1880, when illness took him back to France, where he died. Brosset had practical command of both Georgian and Armenian and contributed to the spread of the knowledge of these cultures in Western Europe in the fields of both philology and history, translating both the Georgian and Armenian chronicles into French. He was the first non-Georgian with competence in Georgian, and he even wrote on Georgian before being invited to Russia. Though Brosset contributed greatly to the study and knowledge of Georgian, he was wrong in classifying it as a member of the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European family. And another to misascribe Indo-European status to Georgian and the other Kartvelian languages was the German Franz Bopp, whose relevant lectures from 1842 and 1845 were entitled On Georgian in relation to its linguistic relations, and secondly, the Caucasian branches of the Indo-European family of languages. Bopp did not know Georgian, nor did he even visit the Caucasus, but rather relied for his raw data on Brosse, for Georgian, and on a fellow German, Georg Rosen, fellow of the German Academy of Sciences, who actually did conduct research in the Caucasus for Georgian sister languages. Rosen delivered 3 papers to the Berlin Academy. Firstly, 1843 on the language of the Laz, secondly, 1844 on the Ossetic language, and thirdly, 1845 on Mingrelian, Svan, and Abkhaz, where he correctly identified the closeness of Abkhaz to Circassian, as Güldenstedt had already realized. Amusingly, Rosen had hoped to find on the territory of Abkhazia a tribe called Azra, which he thought had eluded him. Who were the Azra? By the 1840s, Russia's imperial drive to dominate the whole Caucasus was in full swing. And during the 1830s, a group of Britons had attempted to thwart Muscovy's expansion in this region, which was seen to be a potential threat to Britain's control of the Indian subcontinent and the approaches thereto. All of this is part of what became known as the Great Game. Who was going to get to Afghanistan first? Was it the Brits or was it the Russians? The campaigner, David Urquhart, was the guiding light for this group, championing Turkey over Russia in the region, which he and his fellows felt better served British interests. The group encouraged the Northwest Caucasians to defy Russia. Urquhart, as you may know, actually designed the Circassian flag, which is still in use to this day, and hoped to persuade the British government to back the Northwest Caucasian cause. In this they failed, but 2 of the group, James Stanislaus Bell and John Longworth, were amongst a number of travellers to the Caucasus in the mid to late decades of the 19th century to leave valuable accounts of local peoples, their lands and lifestyles. In his 2-volume work relating his 3-year sojourn among the Circassians, 1837-39, Bell called the 3 ethno-linguistic groups amongst whom he lived the Abazas, by which he meant the Ubuchs, following on Cheleby's use of this term, of course. Secondly, the Circassians. Thirdly, the Azras. Azra is the Ubuch term, Azra, or was the Ubuch term, I suppose, Azra, for the Abkhazians. Therefore, when Rosen came here thinking he'd missed the Azras, he had actually found them because he was working with them and he knew them as the Abkhazians. Now, at the end of his 2nd volume, Bell incorporated a short vocabulary list to illustrate the languages of the 3 local peoples. In the Abkhaz list, we meet what is clearly the modern-day term Agrba, Mingrelian. But the meaning assigned to it by Bell is not Mingrelian. The meaning he assigns to Agrba is slave, which surely speaks volumes about the social standing of Mingrelians in Abkhazia in the 1830s. And it seems that the modern Circassian terms for Mingrelian also double in Circassian as the word for slave. And they look to me, I've only just come across them, as though they might derive from the ancient Greek word for slave, which is doulos. So something very, very interesting sociologically there. If Rosen presented a smattering of materials from a handful of the other, then unknown languages of the Caucasus to his philological peers, it fell to another ethnic German, Anton Schiefner, 1817-79, from Tallinn, to produce a full, that's to say for its time, which again is to say without any detailed treatment of syntax, a full grammatical description of a North Caucasian language. Work accomplished with a level of professional expertise, especially in the rigour of the analysis applied to the sound system, that went beyond anything then available for any Caucasian language, even Georgian. A fellow of the St. Petersburg Academy, he turned his attention at the close of 1853 to bats, or as the Georgians call it, tsovatush, a now moribund language of the Nakh-Venakh family, so related to Chechen and Ingush, spoken only in one village in eastern Georgia, Zemo-Alvani. Schiefner never visited the Caucasus, but worked with material sent from the region, supplemented with information provided by native speaker consultants. Schiefner's status as the pioneer at the Russian Academy for the study of the Caucasian languages was reinforced by his subsequent publications on Avar in 1862 and Udi in 1863, two Dagestanian languages. In addition to these three important contributions of his own, Schiefner, over the course of the next decade, worked on the monographs produced by perhaps the most famous of the early investigators of Caucasian languages, the soldier linguist Baron Pyotr Uslar, who took advantage of his time as a Russian soldier fighting in the Caucasus to work on a number of the languages spoken in the territories which were then either being or had recently been conquered by force of Russian arms. In addition to full descriptions of Abkhaz, Chechen, Avar, Lak, Dargva and Lezgi, plus Tabasaran, which was only published in 1979 from a rediscovered manuscript, Uslar was also the only person to do serious work on Ubukh before the migration of the entire population to Turkey in 1864. Before Uslar's works appeared in the original Russian, Schiefner translated them into German, reworking the materials, especially the phonetics, in so doing, and presenting them according to the order and principles he had established in his own grammars. The order of publication of the German versions was Abkhaz 1863, then Chechen, Lak, Dargva, Avar, and Lezgi. Schiefner, then, is the scholar who, in a sense, built on the work begun only in the 1770s by Güldenstedt's commission and set the study of Caucasian languages on a path that can be recognized as truly modern. And subsequently, much valuable research within the Caucasus was conducted in a variety of disciplines during the late 19th, early 20th centuries by or on behalf of the Imperial Russian Academy, and published in such admirable series as Sbornik Materialov dla pisania местностей plemion Kavkaza. These studies are a credit to the scholars who carried them out. Though after the whole Caucasus was incorporated within the Russian Empire, perhaps it is inappropriate to consider Russian scholarship as illustrating foreign interests here. Continuing the German Caucasological tradition from the turn of the century through to his death was Adolf Dier, 1867 to 1930, working firstly in Tbilisi, then in Munich. His vast output included grammatical sketches of all the autochthonous Caucasian languages. The Caucasus, apart from being a lure to linguists, naturally also attracts mountaineers, and one cannot ignore the man who is credited with being the first to scale Europe's highest peak, Mount Elbrus, in the central Caucasian region of Kabardino-Balkaria, namely the English alpinist and barrister Douglas William Freshfield, 1845 to 1934. In his magnificent two-volume work, Exploration of the Caucasus, which first appeared in 1896, he included a poignant chapter entitled The Solitude of Abkhazia, capturing the pervading emptiness just a few years after the great exodus, the Makhajistva, of the bulk of the Abkhazian population, together, of course, with all the Ubukhs and most of the Circassians, moving to Ottoman lands, presumably, predominantly, as you know, modern-day Turkey. With the establishment of Soviet power throughout the Caucasus in 1921, travel here was fated to become much more difficult than during Tsarist times, with all its bureaucratic trappings. One linguist who did manage to spend time in Tbilisi working on Georgian in the late 1920s was the Norwegian Hans Fucht, who in 1963 published a collection of texts and a dictionary of Ubukh. The American foreign correspondent Negli Farson also travelled in the region in 1929, publishing an absolutely wonderful account of his adventures called Caucasian Journey, published 1951. Once Stalin achieved total mastery of the Kremlin, it became almost impossible for Westerners to reach the area, though the German Caucasologist, mainly Georgianist, Gerhard Datus, did succeed in reaching the Caucasus in the train of the Nazi invasion, World War II. Lack of access remained the norm as far as the North Caucasus was concerned for virtually the entire Soviet period, even if Georgia, including of course Abkhazia, was eventually opened up. The Polish-American anthropologist Sula Bennett visited here, her book, The Abkhazians, the Long-Living People of the Caucasus, being the fruit of her research. It came out in 1974. And so, for most of the Soviet period, linguists wanting to work on Caucasian languages, and it was largely linguists who did work on the region throughout those decades, had to do so by finding native speakers among the diaspora communities based in Turkey. In this regard, the Frenchman Georges Dumézil, 1898 to 1986, stands supreme. Working in Turkey from 1925 and knowing Turkish, he turned his attention to the Caucasian communities living there. Though he wrote on Georgian, Armenian, Laz, and Avar, he devoted most of his linguistic work, as opposed to his mythological studies, to Northwest Caucasian, predominantly Ubukh, mainly in collaboration after 1950 with the last native speaker, Tevfik Esenç, who died in 1992, and to Circassian, though one book was devoted to Abkhaz, his Études Abkhaz, which came out in 1967. His work was carried on by his Paris-based student, the late Georges Sharashidze, who published mainly on Ubukh, but also on Avar and Abkhaz, whilst another student, the late Catherine Paris, extended the study of Circassian. One should also mention the Dutch scholar, Aet Kuipers, born in 1919, and I don't have a death date for him. He may still be alive, whose 1960 phoneme and morpheme in Kabardian quickly became a classic. His pupils include the Circassian specialist Riek Smeets. In England, the classicist phonetician Sidney Allen, 1918 to 2004, also produced the important paper Structure and System in the Abaza Verbal Complex, and Sidney Allen was one of my professors when I was a student. Taking advantage of exchange agreements that came to be established between the Soviet Ministry of Education and relevant bodies in Western countries, a handful of students and/or researchers were able to spend up to one academic year in various parts of the Soviet Union, including, of course, Georgia. Generally, such visitors were concerned with language, literature, or Bible transmission through Georgian and Armenian. This last speciality had a long tradition in the West, illustrated by the work of scholars like Conybeare, Kearsarge Blake, Robert Blake, Maurice Bruyère, Neville Birdsall, Michel van Esbroek, and the still active Bernard Houtier in France. It was thanks to such an agreement with the British Council that I myself, as a postgraduate at Cambridge University, was able to spend the academic year 1975-76 and then again 79-80 in Tbilisi learning Georgian. I was also introduced to Abkhaz, little realizing at the time how intimately destiny would involve me both professionally and personally in Abkhazian affairs. The exchange programs remained in force until the collapse of the USSR, which cataclysmic event led ultimately, if not immediately, to what one might describe as an excess of enthusiasm to capitalize on Russia's retreat from Transcaucasia. The region incorporating the three Soviet republics of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia was little known in the West, other than to the small group of specialist scholars of the kind I've just been mentioning. When new General Secretary of the Communist Party Mikhail Gorbachev suddenly appointed Georgian party boss Eduard Shevardnadze to be the USSR's foreign minister in 1985, Western chancelleries, which had previously regarded Transcaucasia as a sleepy, unimportant backwater, were sent into a spin of confusion as they rushed to find out all they could about the man and his record in power in Georgia from 1972. The real surge of interest, of course, followed the discovery of huge potential oil reserves in the Caspian, previously thought to have been virtually exhausted. Because of America's ludicrous decades-long policy towards Iran and the ongoing conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, a pipeline to the Turkish port of Ceyhan had to be built through Georgia, which raised this country's profile immensely, even if Shevardnadze's image was already starting to tarnish. And so we see again the importance of trade, specifically in oil, as a determiner of Western policy, coupled with the opportunity to widen Western, primarily, of course, US-American influence in an area close to the ever-problematic Middle East. The military aspect of Western interests nicely dovetailed with Mikhail Saakashvili's oft-stated goal of achieving NATO membership for Georgia. Saakashvili curried favor with especially the USA by committing Georgian troops in both Iraq and Afghanistan, on the route to which Georgia is a convenient bridge, as well as being suitably situated should action ever be taken against Iran. And the basis for an ever closer Western rapport with Tbilisi was provided by the decision in 1992 to recognize Georgia within its Soviet borders, a decision which must have been predicated, given the deplorable and at the time deteriorating state of the Republic, on nothing other than regard for Shevardnadze, achieved during his tenure as Soviet foreign minister. What I've tried to demonstrate in this lecture on the general theme of foreign interest in the Caucasus is the role that non-native commentators have played over the centuries in not only shaping our awareness and understanding of the region, but actually in contributing to the correct interpretation of the problems addressed in their research. I mentioned how Schiefner set the standards for linguistic descriptions of the local languages, and the careful accounts coming from him and such others as Uslar helped linguists become better acquainted with such phenomena as ergativity, which is not a typical feature of Indo-European languages. For some time there was a theory popular in certain scholarly circles in Tbilisi and amongst native Caucasian linguists trained there that all the indigenous Caucasian languages derive from a single common ancestor. Though, as stated, Datas was primarily interested in the Kartvelian languages, he contributed in 1955 an important paper asking if class marking, typical of the Nakh Dagestanian group, had been present in all Caucasian languages. His convincing demonstration that this belief was mistaken helped to debunk this false hypothesis, and the Kartvelian language family is now universally regarded as having no genetic affiliation to the North Caucasian languages. Well, it is patently obvious to all observers that there are many problems in the Caucasus that need to be solved, and one would hope that scholars can play a helping role to achieve such ends. The conflicts that erupted here around the time of the USSR's dissolution have drawn in a number of organizations of different types, for example, conflict resolution experts and aid workers. But the question has to be asked to what extent both they and decision makers, that's to say basically politicians, in Western capitals fully understood, or dare we say even still understand, the nature of the disputes they found themselves addressing. It has been for 21 years my firm conviction that the decision to recognize Georgia within its Soviet, let's be honest about it, Stalinist frontiers was misguided and based on ignorance of the internal state of the country at the time. Though I came to Georgia, Abkhazia as a linguist, my interests eventually moved into politics, and ever hopeful, despite copious examples to the contrary, that dissemination of facts should facilitate correct decision-making in this or that sphere of activity, I have, since 1989, set myself the task of publicizing what I trust to be accurate information about Abkhazia and the conflict with Georgia. And my latest contribution to this endeavor is this, my latest book, published earlier this year in Holland, Discordant Neighbors, a reassessment of the Georgian, Abkhazian, Georgian, South Ossetian conflicts. Finally, then, I take this opportunity to mention again my belief that greater engagement on the part of Western scholars, politicians, academic institutions, and commercial companies with Abkhazia is essential in order to better understand the country and help its regeneration following the 1992-93 war and the subsequent years of hardship, for the benefit of all of Abkhazia's residents and indeed the Republic's neighbours. Thank you very much.
I'm a second-year student of international relations, and first of all, I'd like to say that your lecture was very interesting.
Thank you.
And the second is my question divided into two parts. Well, the first part is how do you think does our language have future? And the second part is what do we need to do for our language not to be died?
Not to die out.
Yes. Thanks.
Well, I would hope your language has a future, and it's entirely up to you as native speakers to ensure that it is continued. I'm sure many people in the audience here are aware that in answer to a similar question put to me in previous years here in Sukhum, how can we ensure we keep our language alive? My answer was simply speak to one another in it. And that is the solution. If you do that, it will survive. And my belief as a linguist, in fact, I would say perhaps one of the reasons I became involved in the politics here in 1989 was because I had the immense privilege in 1974 when I was in Turkey of meeting the last speaker of Ubuk, Tevfik Esenç, as I mentioned, and that seemed to me such a sad thing that with his death in 1992 the entire language and basically the associated culture, not everything of course, but basically the associated culture was gone, and I felt that there was a distinct threat to the future of the Abkhazians, therefore the future of the Abkhazian language in 1989 with the rise of nationalism in Georgia, that I decided to try and do something about it. Yes, I do hope it has a future. I think we should do what we can to preserve languages, because it is reckoned that at the moment, roughly on average, one language around the world dies in every 2-week period. Every 2 weeks, one language is reckoned to die. And as a linguist, this saddens me. So I wish you well in your endeavours.
Thanks for your answer, and would you be so kind to understand the next question, to answer the next question? The next question is, how do you think, how will our relations with Georgia and Russia will develop in the future? How do you think?
Well, how will they develop? It's a very difficult question to answer, of course. It's one that everyone, I'm sure, is thinking about and would like to know the answer to. I think the first thing, in order to improve the situation here specifically in Abkhazia, is that the so-called friends of Georgia, Western countries who regard themselves as the true friends of Georgia, should do what they can to persuade the Georgian authorities to recognize Abkhazia. In fact, in the book, my recommendation is that we need not 3 states in Transcaucasia, but 6. We need to have Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh and South Ossetia recognized as 6 states, and then hopefully normal relations can be resumed between Abkhazians, Georgians, Ossetian Georgians, Armenians and Azerbaijanians. If that were to be achieved, what would Russia want to do about it? This is a big question, and I'm not entirely certain that even the Russian authorities perhaps know. But it would be very, very interesting if the local peoples could sort out their difficulties to see what Russia's reaction would be. And I think I'm not in a position to say what it is likely to be, or maybe, well, I can say what it should be. It should be to recognize realities and form good neighborly relations with the Georgians, particularly, again. Whether that will happen, of course, big question mark.
Thank you very much, George, for this wonderful presentation. Of course, you do a great job in the West in terms of promoting the interest towards Abkhazia, towards our culture, language, history, and everybody here in Abkhazia is very grateful to you for this. I'm not asking about the history and historical narratives and the role of historical narratives in the situation in the Caucasus political situation. Of course, everybody knows that historical narratives, conflicting narratives, very often fuel political clashes, and it's very difficult to answer whether history can serve a positive role in terms of peaceful coexistence in the Caucasus. But my question is about Western perception or perceptions of Abkhazia. What are the major myths in the Western, if I can put it like this, in the Western consciousness or West popular consciousness, myths about Abkhazia that should be dispelled by our own means, by the means of our friends in the world, and what is the most important in terms of our history or anything that the Western people should know, and this can help us to transcend the so-called isolation that we suffer and gain international recognition. So that is my question. Thank you very much.
Yes. Well, you ask what the popular conception or misconception in the West about Abkhazia might be. I think a basic problem is that most people in the West are not aware of Abkhazia, either as a country or as a problem to be resolved. This has been one of the difficulties right from the start. As I said, I think during my lecture, when the Soviet Union fell apart, although we had numerous Kremlinologists working away in the West at Western universities, the collapse of the Soviet Union came as a huge surprise, I think, to them all. And so if concentrating on just Moscow and Russia and what Russia was doing within the Soviet Union, if they couldn't see that things were moving towards collapse as of the late 1980s, then it's not surprising, I suppose, that they shouldn't have understood the realities of life in the various peripheral republics. And I think it's definitely the case that there was little knowledge of what was happening in Georgia and little knowledge of Georgian in general at the moment of recognition. And unfortunately, of course, once a country is recognized and diplomatic relations are established, as happened very, very shortly after Shevardnadze's return to Tbilisi in the spring of 1992, Western leaders simply tend to take a view, we've recognized this country, therefore everything that happens within its borders is the concern of that government. And of course, Georgia, again, I think, as a result of a huge mistake, was given membership of the United Nations just weeks, literally weeks, before the invasion of Abkhazia took place. And then you're a member state of the United Nations, so there are various secessionist movements in member states. The governments don't want to discuss their own secessionist problems, therefore they're not going to stand up in defense of the case of the Abkhazians, South Ossetians, as it may be. But I think what needs to be done, and I'm wondering, I'm not a great user myself of Facebook and these methods of communicating through the social media. I'm not of that age, but it seems to me that maybe through contacts with Facebook, you young people who use it, you're knowledgeable about Abkhazia, you're knowledgeable about the situation here. Generally, if people come to the Caucasus, whatever reason, they come to Georgia and they learn about local issues essentially through the Georgian prism, which of course is unfavorable to Abkhazia. So you have to combat that. And Georgia has a lot of friends in the West. One in particular, of course, we spoke about, you and I the other week, came here a few weeks ago on a short trip, Daniel Hamilton, and wrote on his blog when he got back across the river Ingo how nice it was to get back to a country where there is freedom and the rule of law. Absolutely ridiculous. But you have people presenting this image of the conflict here, and in some cases, because you're a largely unrecognized country, no diplomatic representation here, travellers are advised by, for instance, my own Ministry of Foreign Affairs not to come here. So some people are put off from coming to Abkhazia because of this advice. So you have to do simply what you can, and it's something I've been trying to do myself, as I say, for, 24 years actually, from 1989. Present the image. Who are the Abkhazians? What is their historical case for not being part of Georgia? Why is it impossible to consider Abkhazia's return to Georgia? And do what you can to get people coming here and see for themselves. Because a number of times over the years I've met foreigners who come here and they're introduced to me, read my writings maybe, and say, oh, it's interesting, you know, we've come in from Georgia. Abkhazia just isn't what we were led to believe it to be. In Georgia, we were told it's a criminal regime, it's under occupation, it's dangerous for Westerners to be here. Life here is not like that at all. So the more you can do to encourage people to come and see for themselves, and it's going to be a long and difficult job, but I know that within your foreign ministry there have been improvements over recent years, creation of a really good website in various languages. This is all important for disseminating, let's say, the truth, the facts about Abkhazia, and I just encourage you, all of you, to do what you can through your own contacts on these social media networks.
First of all, I'm very grateful for your visit, and I'd like to thank you for your very interesting lecture. So my question, what reaction was in Great Britain after recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and what attitude is to Abkhazia now?
I was here in Abkhazia on the day of recognition, and so I was not actually in Great Britain to talk about the immediate reaction. But in general, of course, one knows that because of recognition of Georgia, as I mentioned a moment ago, going back to 1992, commentators, politicians, foreign ministries in the West have all stated consistently, I think, over the last 5 years, that Russia violated international law by recognizing these two states. This is the standard. This is the standard view, and I think on one occasion I tried contacting our current foreign minister, William Hague, about this issue, and the standard response is, before we can discuss this, Russia has to go back to abiding by international law and withdraw its recognition of these two states. That's the standard position. So this is what you're fighting against. The decision of 1992 and everything that follows from it. But unfortunately, this is the view amongst important players, that Russia was wrong in taking these decisions, but Russia, in response, has equally consistently stated that it has no intention of changing its mind. But as I said here before, I've often felt as though I've been banging my head against a brick wall, trying to disseminate information about Abkhazia, so I would encourage you to join me banging your heads against the brick wall as well.
Thank you for your visit, for your very interesting lecture, and for your Abkhazian language. I was happy when I listened. And was it so hard to learn it? Thanks. And my question. I'd like to ask you about our foreign policy in Great Britain. Which things had been achieved in our relations with Great Britain, as you are the ambassador of Abkhazia in Great Britain?
Let me downplay my role. I'm not sure to what extent I have been terribly effective in this. There was a time when I used to receive invitations to attend parties, evening parties at the Foreign Office in Great Britain, in London, but that stopped sometime in the 1990s because I think my views are not highly regarded in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So to what extent I've played a part, I can't say. But of course there are organisations, and one thinks particularly of the non-governmental organisation Conciliation Resources, which certainly since the mid-1990s, I can't remember when they first became involved here, but say the mid-1990s, they have been doing their best to work with both sides, the Georgians and the Abkhazians, and as we speak, there is a joint delegation visiting both London and Edinburgh, Georgian and Abkhazian, trying to bring the sides together. And Conciliation Resources receives its funding, well, maybe not all of its funding, but a substantial part of its funding, I believe, from the British government. So there must be elements within the British governmental structure which is interested, shall we say, interested in resolution to the conflict. Therefore, money is provided to help Conciliation Resources do its work. And one of the people who works closely with them, and he was here in Abkhazia about 2 months ago, is someone who used to work in the Foreign Office Research Department, and Craig Oliphant, and he now works with another NGO called Save a World, and I know he is very committed both to the region and to helping peaceful resolution of the problems, and he is with his contacts at the Foreign Office constantly making the case for continued payment for the sort of work that Conciliation Resources does. Because in these days, I mentioned the economic crisis, I think, during my talk, the West in general is in a very, very bad situation regarding financial questions, and constantly belts are being tightened, less money is being spent, and I think as long as you have him batting for you, as we would say in a cricketing analogy, then this is all to the good.
You were always welcome in our country. I'm sure you will be, without a doubt. I just want to ask you about what our country, Abkhazia, should do or can do for another country will recognize our independence. And second question, what Georgia, how do you think Georgia will ever do something for handing our relationship between our country, or will ever recognize our independence?
With your Deputy Foreign Minister sitting here in the front row, all I can suggest with regard to the first part of your question is that the Foreign Ministry and its representatives continue to do what they've been doing over recent years, continue to make contacts, continue to talk with representatives of towns, cities, states, countries. We think recently of the agreement between an Italian city and Sukhum. I know some years ago, before the war, Sukhum was twinned with Kilmarnock in Scotland. And I'm wondering, we're wondering, whether something can be done to re-energize that link, because it's rather fallen into abeyance over the last 15 years or so. You will have gathered from what I've said already that I think it's actually in Georgia's own interests to recognise Abkhazia. I can't see that it's in Georgia's interest to have the rail link between Russia and Georgia-Armenia closed ever since 1992. But as some other commentators have said, even if you've got a Georgian leader, who knows that the best thing for Georgia is to recognise Abkhazia, it would be suicide for him to stand up and say it in public. A similar sort of thing was stated with reference to general policy in Western democracies. While I was here, I saw it on television. Again, talking about financial crisis, the commentator was saying, or even a politician, I can't remember who it was saying, it's all very well, we know what has to be done, but if we say we're going to do it, we will never get elected. So you have to appeal to your electorate in a democracy to get into power. And then, if you change your policy, people accuse you, well, you didn't tell us you were going to do this. Well, that might be the case in Georgia, which is why I say I think it's up to Georgia's Western friends to tell them. If you want more benefits from the West, you really must sort out your problem with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So I'm putting the burden on the West rather than wait for someone to appear in Tbilisi who puts himself up to be shot down, literally, by saying, I'm going to recognize Abkhazia.
So let's abstract now from the serious questions. I would like to ask you, when you first appeared in Abkhazia, what was the most surprising thing about our country? Maybe something that really surprised you, and if there was any embarrassing story or situation connecting to Abkhazian culture, it would be great just to listen to it. Thank you.
Just to mention the second part of your question first, there have been so many embarrassing situations over the last 30 my mathematics, I came here in 76, so it's 37 years. Yes, 37 years since I first came to Abkhazia. So many embarrassing situations. I don't know whether I should mention any of them. I said to, I think, maybe one of the groups I spoke to at the university last week or the week before, I think it was, I first came here on the 1st of April 1976. And it was a 13-hour bus drive from Tbilisi. It was dark when I arrived. I took a taxi from the station to the old Abkhazia hotel on the seafront. It was totally dark. I couldn't see anything. Woke up the next morning, drew back the blinds, and what did I see? It was a day like today. Beautiful, beautiful, calm, blue sea in the bay here. And my room was in such a situation that if I went on the balcony and leaned over like this, I could see all of these beautiful little houses dotted around the hills to the east of the capital. And they seemed all to be painted in a different colour. And I thought, what a delightful place this is. I hadn't realised until that moment, early on the 2nd of April, 1976. So that was my first revelation, if you like, being here in Abkhazia. Shall I just mention one embarrassing situation? Shall I just mention one embarrassing situation? Yeah? Yes. I had a very good friend, and I'd better not mention who it was because of current political difficulties, but I had a very good friend, okay, from Tbilisi, and I'd made an arrangement to meet him in Ochemchira, because my wife's family comes from Ochemchira. We were staying there. I made an arrangement to meet him 7 o'clock this particular evening. Okay, so we're on our way back from Kandugh, where my wife had relatives. We went to Tamsh, where she has relatives. And I didn't know, but as soon as the family saw me getting out of the car, they went and killed a sheep as a mark of honour for my arrival. Yeah? So the big feast going to take place. And I said, no, we're not going to eat here. Look at the time. We have to be back in Ochemchira to meet this visitor. Yeah, a Caucasian, I might add. So I insisted that we leave, that we not eat, get back in the car, and I didn't know until I got back to Ochemchira that this animal had been slaughtered in my honour, and this is a great insult to the Abkhazia. I didn't know this. Went back to Ochemchira, maybe 6:45, sat, waited. He never came. We could have stayed in Tamsh and eaten the sheep, and I wouldn't have insulted anybody. So that was one insult to Abkhazian tradition. An embarrassing moment. Satam.
As we know, your book is about situation in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And was it difficult to find a publishing company in Britain for this book?
Yes. Yes, it was. I had been asked in when was it? About 2008, maybe. Yes, about 2008, 2009, I was asked by a publishing firm in Cambridge if I would write a book on the hotspots. They have a series, this publishing house has a series of hotspots around the world, and they wanted a book on Georgia to deal with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And they approached me, and I said, you know, you're approaching someone who is regarded as a representative of Abkhazia, honorary consul. I said, yes, we know that. They said, but we want you to write it. So I eventually agreed, and I wrote what I wanted to be my book. So essentially I wrote this, all right? And the publishing house agreed that I should submit the manuscript in December 2010. In November 2010, as I was finishing the typing, I thought I would read my contract. And I saw there how many words they wanted the book to contain. And I did a word count, and already I had written twice as much as they wanted. So I knew I would have problems. Anyway, I sent the manuscript off. Sure enough, about 3 months later, after, I think, 4 maybe, assessors had read it, anonymous assessors, comments came back. If you want us to publish your book, you have to reduce the number of words by 50%, and you have to be more balanced in your treatment of the Abkhazian Georgian case, and you have to remove comments about yourself. There's too much of you in it. So I wrote back and said, no. I said, this is the book I want to be published. I'm not going to abide by these recommendations. So they said, in that case, we won't publish it. So then I had to start submitting the manuscript to other publishers. I tried a publisher in Britain and eventually went to Brill, who are noted Orientalist publishers in Holland. And after a certain time, with, of course, recommendations again to change the emphasis here, change that, they agreed to publish it. So essentially, this was written as of December 2010. But it was only published in spring of this year. So because of that delay, I was able to include developments from 2010 through to 2012. And of course, important period, election of a new president here in Abkhazia, and so on and so forth. So yes, it was difficult. And one problem is theory doesn't interest me. Linguistic theory, political theory, philosophy, not interested in these questions. I'm interested in correct descriptions of language and, as I've said, hopefully disseminating accurate information about Abkhazia. But when a manuscript goes out to political scientists, they are looking at the model, the method, the theory within which you're framing your book. So I've had comments, where's the theory here? What model is he using? I'm not interested in such questions. So you always have to be wary of the sort of comments you're going to get back from anonymous reviewers. And although the field of Caucasologists isn't all that large, it's usually not the case that you can tell who wrote which comment. Looking at the way they write it, sometimes you can say, oh, this must be a non-native speaker of English because of mistakes. Or looking at American spellings, maybe it's from America, although then computers these days automatically give you the American spelling. So you can never be sure. You can never be sure who's commenting on you. But yes, it was difficult. It was.
Great to listen you once again after your inaugural lecture. It was very delightful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, you mentioned something about to using some facilities about internet and some other, let's say, instruments like Facebook. As a being of member of the diaspora, I think that you can say something about to young people in Abkhazia, that they should contact with some their relatives in diaspora, namely in Turkey, some other countries as well. Mm-hmm. I don't know, would you like to say something about using some contemporary, let's say, facilities like internet, Facebook, is it going to be helpful for the recognition of Abkhazia in order to communication with the Turkey and the
yes.
some other diasporas like Syrian issues?
I think given that there are more ethnic Abkhazians living in Turkey than there are living in Abkhazia, the role of the diaspora community is potentially extremely important. So the more links that you can establish, the better. Yes, I agree. And you've got an audience here if you're able to exchange, addresses, email addresses, Facebook addresses. This is, by the way, I may tell you, an old friend of mine, ethnically Ubukh, from Turkey. As he said, he came to my inaugural professorial lecture in London in 1998, Hokanis Can. And so let me introduce you to him, and I'm sure he'd be pleased to hear from you through these networks that he's just mentioned.
Но я же говорила, что здесь очень много активных молодых людей. Активные, правда же? Ай, Асаруко, Дары, Радшан. Мы понимаем, что живем в очень сложном мире, осознаем, что не мудрость правит миром, иначе нам не приходилось бы доказывать, что мы не чужие. Я недавно вспомнила Искандера, Фазиля Искандера, который очень много говорит об уме и мудрости. И он говорит, что для мудрости принципиально нет чужих. К сожалению, поскольку то, о чем говорит этот мыслитель великий, пока еще не произошло в этом мире, в человеческом сообществе нам приходится доказывать, что мы на этой земле, и в этом мире, в этом сообществе, международном сообществе не чужие. Я это говорю, потому что вы говорили о том, что мы должны о себе говорить, заявлять, информировать и так далее, и так далее. Спасибо вам огромное за последовательность, за преданность науке, за профессионализм, за принципиальность и смелость в науке. Апсуа, зукугуруа, рачахузхо, зугурарго, захши, хатыракур, соргу, зазду и зухан, аджика надхаму пархот. Шараф зухана. Пщина пяшук скорахис япснала силас и сахауит, George Hewitt, таджика надрымов апсуаха. Спасибо вам за отношение к нашему народу, нашей стране, за ваш неустанный труд, за то, что вы всегда с нами и за то, что вы очень настоящие. Спасибо огромное. Эта лекция профессора Джорджа Хьюитта должна была состояться гораздо раньше, но произошло, к сожалению, вот таким образом, но тем не менее. Я сегодняшнего дня могу гордиться тем, что вы были за этой кафедрой, что вы были на нашей кафедре. Это была кафедра лекции на абхазском телевидении. Спасибо.